A pistol so obscure one movie saved the company from bankruptcy. A revolver tied to one of the most photographed murders in American history. A World War II machine gun pulled from a Brooklyn closet. And a rocket launcher, Charles Bronson, mail-ordered to blow a man in half. Death Wish 3 might be the most ridiculous arsenal ever assembled in one film. But here's what nobody tells you. Every gun is real. Every story is real. And one of them changed the firearms industry. Pull up a chair. The face of Death Wish 3 is a pistol almost nobody had heard of before 1985. It is the Wildey Hunter, chambered in .475 Wildey Magnum, designed by an American engineer named Will D.J. Moore. Moore drew up the original pistol in 1973. He drew up the cartridge in 1977. And he finally got the gun into production in 1984, 4 years behind schedule, after more than a decade of patents, prototypes, and tooling delays. The Wildey is a gas-operated, double-action, single-stack semi-automatic. It was the first gas-operated double-action pistol ever made for the civilian market. It feeds from a 7-round magazine. Barrels come in 8, 10, and 12 inches. The frame is stainless steel. The receiver is built to withstand breech pressures over 48,000 pounds per square inch. That is more pressure than 3 school buses stacked on the rear axle of a Toyota Camry. And every part of that engineering is in service of one thing: hunting. Moore designed the Wildey not as a defensive sidearm, not as a target pistol, not as a service weapon. He designed it as a handgun a man could take into the woods to kill a bear. Now, ask yourself why we are talking about a hunting pistol in a vigilante movie about New York street gangs. Hold that question. We will come back to it. First, the cartridge. The .475 Wildey Magnum is what makes this gun terrifying. The case is built from .284 Winchester brass, necked up and widened to accept a 475 thousandths of an inch bullet. That is almost half an inch of solid copper-jacketed lead, wider than a number 2 pencil, 2 main loadings, a 250-grain bullet at 1,850 feet per second, producing 1,900 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, and a 300-grain bullet at 1,610 feet per second, producing 1,727 foot-pounds. Now, to give you a sense of what those numbers mean, a standard .44 Magnum out of a 7.5-inch revolver produces about 740 foot-pounds at the muzzle. The .475 Wildey, at 100 yards downrange, still has more energy than the .44 Magnum has the moment it leaves the barrel. Read that one more time. At 100 yards, the Wildey is doing more work than Dirty Harry's gun is doing point blank. This is the gun Clint Eastwood was scared of. Now back to the question, why is this hunting pistol the face of a vigilante movie? Because the entire pitch of Death Wish 3 is escalation. The first Death Wish had Charles Bronson carrying a small .32 caliber Colt police-positive revolver, pocket gun, almost a toy. The second one bumped him up to a .380 Beretta, still nothing special. By the third one, Michael Winter and Bronson needed a gun the audience had never seen before, that looked bigger than Dirty Harry, that hit harder than Dirty Harry, and that visually told you Paul Kersey was now operating on a completely different level than every action star of the era. The Wildey did all of that. The barrel is long enough to be mistaken for a section of pipe. The frame is huge. The muzzle hole is almost half an inch of empty space staring back at you. And when Bronson fires it, the recoil rolls his entire arm back like he is bench pressing each shot. Here is the part of the story most people miss. The Wildey in the film is Bronson's own gun. He owned a personal Wildey before production started, he liked it, and he suggested the production use it. According to the IMFDB, the screen weapon is the 8-inch barrel variant. The Wikipedia entry on Wildey states Bronson personally owned a 10-inch brushed stainless model. Both are likely correct because Bronson owned more than one. Either way, the movie shoots his actual pistol. And here is the part that goes from interesting to genuinely strange. When Death Wish 3 hit theaters in 1985, Wildey Incorporated was on the edge of collapse. The cartridge had been designed 8 years earlier. The pistol had been in production for less than 12 months. Almost nobody outside of a tiny circle of handgun hunters had ever heard of the gun. The movie grossed $16.1 million, a modest return by Hollywood standards. But the bump in Wildey orders that followed was enough to keep the company from going under. Founder Wildey went on record stating that every single time Death Wish 3 airs on cable, sales spike. To this day, the pistol is referred to in the industry as the Bronson gun. File that one away. Now, before we move on, one more thing. There is a line in the film where Bronson tells a fellow tenant that a .475 Wildey Magnum is, in his words, a shorter version of the African big game cartridge. That line is technically incorrect. The .475 Wildey is based on the .284 Winchester, an American hunting round, not the .475 Nitro Express, which is the British African big game cartridge from the early 1900s. Bronson almost certainly meant to say the round was inspired by an African cartridge, rather than being a shorter version of one. Forgivable mistake from the actor, not forgivable from the screenwriter. Anyway, moving on. The Wildey is Kersey's headline gun, but he carries a backup, and the backup is a Colt Cobra. The Colt Cobra is a lightweight, aluminum-framed, double-action snub-nose revolver, 6 rounds, chambered in .38 Special, designed by Colt in 1950 as a lighter version of the Detective Special. Same Colt D frame, same overall geometry, same 6-shot cylinder. The difference is the receiver. Where the Detective Special was forged from steel, the Cobra was forged from aluminum alloy. The result was a 15-ounce revolver, about 5 ounces lighter than the Detective Special. Light enough that a plainclothes detective could carry it on his ankle all day and forget it was there. Production ran from 1950 to 1981. So by the time Death Wish 3 was filmed, the Cobra had been out of production for 4 years. Kersey is already carrying a piece of obsolete law enforcement hardware. Now, ask yourself why this gun matters in this movie. Because the Cobra is what the Wildey is not. The Wildey is impossible to conceal. Over 12 inches long, more than 4 pounds loaded. You cannot hide it under a jacket. You cannot draw it fast. You cannot use it in a phone booth. The Cobra is the opposite of all of that. The Cobra is what you reach for when the situation does not allow the Wildey. When the Wildey is in your coat pocket and a kid pulls a knife. When you are pinned in close quarters and the bigger gun is in your other hand and empty. Watch the film carefully. Almost every time Kersey transitions from one threat to the next, the Cobra is the bridge. The Wildey is the statement. The Cobra is the work. Here is the piece of trivia we have to flag, because it is the most infamous thing about this particular firearm. A Colt Cobra was the gun Jack Ruby used to kill Lee Harvey Oswald on the 24th of November, 1963, 2 days after the Kennedy assassination, on live television, in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. That specific revolver was sold at auction in 1991 for $220,000. So when Bronson is carrying a Cobra in Death Wish 3, the gun in his hand is the same model as one of the most photographed murder weapons in American history. Michael Winter did not pick that gun by accident. The Cobra had a cultural weight in 1985 that almost no other revolver carried. Putting it in a vigilante's pocket was loud. Now, let me poke a hole or two in the legend, because somebody has to. Here is where the Death Wish 3 arsenal starts to fall apart under inspection. Kersey is shown mail ordering his Wildey Hunter directly to his apartment in New York City. There is a problem with that. The Gun Control Act of 1968 made direct mail order of firearms to consumers illegal in the United States. 17 years before this movie was filmed, every gun ordered by mail in 1985 had to be shipped to a federal firearms licensee, not to a private home. Michael Winter either did not know or did not care. Watch the film. The Wildey shows up in a box. Kersey opens it, he reloads it, he shoots a man. That is not how it worked in 1985. That is not how it works now. Forgiven because the movie is a fantasy, but it has to be flagged. Now, we step up to the heavy hardware. Bennett, the World War II veteran played by Martin Balsam, shows Kersey a cupboard full of weapons that belong to his deceased friend Charlie, the Korean war buddy whose murder kicks off the entire film. Inside that cupboard is a Browning M1919 A4, the standard American medium machine gun of the Second World War. The M1919 A4 is the air-cooled, belt-fed 30-06 lineal descendant of John Moses Browning's water-cooled M1917 heavy machine gun from the First World War. Browning designed the original, The Army adopted the air-cooled M1919 variant in 1919. The A4 version, with the 24-inch barrel and the M2 tripod, was standardized in 1936 and went on to become the most produced American medium machine gun of the entire war. Roughly 438,000 of them were built between 1936 and 1945, enough machine guns to give one to every man, woman, and child in a city the size of Miami. The gun weighs 31 pounds without the tripod, 48 pounds with it. That is about the weight of a fully loaded suitcase before a long-haul flight. It fires from a 250-round fabric belt or metallic disintegrating links. Cyclic rate is approximately 450 rounds per minute, about 7.5 rounds every second. Effective range is 600 yards. Maximum range is 1,500 yards. It was used in every major American conflict from World War II through Vietnam, where the U.S. Navy ran them off riverboats well into the late 60s. And in Death Wish 3, an aging civilian and an old neighbor drag one out of a closet, set it up on a fire escape, and use it to mow down 100 street punks in front of a Brooklyn tenement. Here is the nitpick. The M1919I4 is a recoil-operated machine gun designed to be fired from a tripod or a fixed mount. The gas pressure cycle relies on the gun being absolutely rigid against a solid base. Fire it without a tripod, without a pinel, without a bipod, and the action will not fully cycle. The bolt will fail to lock. The gun will jam inside the first few rounds. There is no real-world scenario in which two men handhold an M1919 and put down sustained automatic fire from a fire escape. The Death Wish 3 version of this gun behaves like an M60, the gun the Army adopted in 1959 to replace it. The M60 can do that. The M1919 cannot. Michael Winner either did not know, did not care, or simply needed the scene to look the way it looks. The scene looks great. The gun does not work that way. Now, the moment the entire film has been building toward, the M72 LAW light anti-armor weapon, the single-shot, disposable, fiberglass-tubed 66mm rocket launcher developed by Hesse Eastern in 1963 to give an American infantryman a man-portable, throwaway anti-tank weapon for the Cold War in Europe. This is real military hardware. The M72 LAW was adopted by the United States Army in 1963 to replace the Korean War-era M20 Super Bazooka. It is a smoothbore launcher tube that telescopes from 24 8/10 inches, collapsed to 34 7/10 inches extended. The whole weapon with its rocket weighs about 5 pounds, less than a gallon of milk. The rocket is a 66mm heat round. Heat stands for high explosive anti-tank. The warhead uses a shaped copper charge that on impact collapses into a directional jet, capable of punching through 8 inches of rolled homogeneous armor steel, 2 feet of reinforced concrete, or 6 feet of compacted earth. That is enough penetration to go through the side of an apartment building and out the other side. Effective range is 200 meters against point targets, 350 meters against vehicle-sized targets. The backblast danger zone behind the fire is roughly 15 meters in a 90-degree rear arc, hot enough to cook a man at touching distance. The M72A2 specifically was the second generation, an improvement on the original A1 with a better rocket motor and longer effective range. It saw extensive combat use in Vietnam. Now, here is what makes the LAW scene in Death Wish 3 particularly insane. Kersey orders the LAW the same way he ordered the Wildey, by mail, to his apartment in New York. The LAW is a weapon of war. It is regulated as a destructive device under the National Firearms Act of 1934. Federal registration, a $200 tax stamp per round. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms approval before transfer. Michael Winner just has Kersey open a cardboard box and pull out a 66mm anti-tank rocket as casually as if it were a toaster. And then there is the firing itself. Kersey fires the LAW from inside Charlie's apartment building, at gang leader Manny Fraker, at close range. 3 things wrong with that. 1, the backblast inside an enclosed room would have killed Kersey instantly. 2, the rocket has a minimum arming distance of roughly 10 meters, meaning at close range the warhead does not fully arm and may not detonate at all. 3, The building behind Fraker should have been demolished in a way that makes the on-screen explosion look almost polite. Forgiven, because it is one of the most absurdly satisfying movie kills of the entire decade. But flagged, because if anyone watching this video ever tries that at home, your apartment will be a parking lot and you will be a smudge. Now let me bring it all home. Look at the arc of these 4 weapons. A custom hunting pistol designed by an engineer almost nobody had heard of, in a cartridge bigger than .44 Magnum, hand-loaded by the protagonist himself. A discontinued aluminum-frame police revolver tied to one of the most infamous murders in American history. The American medium machine gun of the Second World War, dragged out of a closet by an old man, used to massacre street punks. And a Vietnam-era infantry rocket launcher, mail-ordered to a Brooklyn apartment, used to vaporize the bad guy at point-blank range. 4 weapons, 4 completely different eras, 4 completely different threat scales. The pistol is for the individual fight, the revolver is for the close fight, the machine gun is for the squad fight, the rocket launcher is for the war. That is the entire pitch of Death Wish 3. The world has become so lawless, so out of control, so hostile to the ordinary citizen, that an architect from New York has to escalate from a hunting pistol to a rocket launcher in the space of a single afternoon. That is not a coherent political statement, it is a fantasy. But it is a fantasy with real guns in it, and the guns are doing the talking. So how do we score this arsenal? On the deadliness scale, 12 out of 10, every single one of these weapons would, in the real world, do exactly what the film says it does, and worse. On the historical accuracy scale, somewhere around 5 out of 10, the Wildey is real and Bronson's own. The Cobra is correctly depicted. The M1919 exists and looks right, but does not work that way handheld. The Law exists and looks right, but cannot be mail-ordered, cannot be fired from inside an apartment, and cannot kill one man at touching distance without taking the building with him. Death Wish 3 is the kind of movie that uses real hardware and treats it like cartoon hardware. And in its defense, that is exactly what its audience wanted in 1985. All right, your turn. Which of the 4 would you rather have in a real fight? The Wildey, the Cobra, the M1919, or the Law? Did you know about the Wildey saving the company from bankruptcy before today? And which other cult action film should we dig into next? Drop your pick in the comments. Hit the like button if this earned it. Subscribe because we have a lot more guns to take apart. And if you want to see another gun taken apart, that video is right there.